I'm Dr. Joseph MT, Department of Sociology, University of Mumbai, and this is the e-Pathshala project on religion and society. Module 23, Islamic reform movements in India. In this module, we will look at the way that reform movements have taken shape within Muslim communities in India. We have two sections here. In section 1, we look at reform movements which are of an internal nature, reform within Islam. And the second section, we look at reform that is triggered by kind of developments from the outside. Though both are happening within the Muslim community, there is a difference between both of these. And this is what we are looking at in this module. The Arabic terminologies such as tajdeed, islah, nahda were widely used to signify the existence of reform within Islamic teachings. These variations signify different kinds of reform endeavors. While tajdeed manifests the more traditional religious reformation, islah is widely utilized by Salafi, Wahhabi political and religious outfits to express their idea of reform. At the same time, the word nahda, which also means reform, renovation, etc., was used to describe mainly the European Renaissance and its resonances in the Muslim world and its consequent literal, social and political awakenings. But the word tajdeed, which connotes a going back to the original religious teachings, is widely accepted by almost every sect within Islam. Even though the ijtihad, which does independent research on the Quran and Hadith to resolve issues of day-to-day human life, the qualification for doing this research and the authenticity of the Hadith are matters of controversy throughout Islamic history. After the formation of the four schools of Islamic jurisprudence fiqh in the first 150 years of Islam, these schools witnessed differential growth, spread, splits and even absorption by other schools. Notwithstanding these changes, the majority of Muslims everywhere continue to adhere to the taqlid, which is to follow the traditions and finding out solutions from the Islamic texts for their newly emerging problems, as well as justifying the stance of religious scholarship. Outside influence. William Montgomery Watt argues that three Hellenistic waves which affected the Muslim world and reshaped the intellectualism of the community. The first was the introduction of Greek philosophy and teachings with its ensuing Mu'tazilat and Ash'arite scholarship. The second wave in the first half of the 10th century when several Muslim philosophers and intellectuals such as Al-Farabi, Al-Kindi, Avicenna, etc. further developed the Greek philosophy and fused it with Islamic thought, which resulted in the emergence of pseudo-Islamic Neoplatonic intellectual groups like Ikhwan al-Safa or Brethren of Purity. But this scholarship was demolished by the influential Islamic philosopher Al-Ghazali, who rejected the certainties of sense perception, stressing instead the importance of the transcendental revelation. The third wave of Hellenism starts with the intellectual, cultural, commercial, political dealings of Europe with the Muslim world, which further escalated after the 18th century as its subsequent political encounters with each other throughout the African and Asian continents. These engagements of European modernity with the Muslim world actually began with the discovery of the commercial route to India by Vasco da Gama in 1498. In due course, commerce led to political interference and finally to political domination. By Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1798, the Ottoman and Persian empires felt the full impact of European presence everywhere. These successive 2 centuries of perennial warfare further prevented the Muslim world from accessing European modernity and its scholarship. Even in this aggravated situation, some historians argue that the ulama stand for reform of the community and expedited the tendency of internal criticism to a large extent. Such criticisms were to be witnessed in the revulsion against colonialism on the one hand and on the other an exposure to secular ideas through their contact with European modernity. Both these influences sought to highlight the backwardness of the traditional ulama, which continued to display disinterest in the new ideas that were entering the Islamic world. It is this dynamic between traditional religious scholarship and the onset of Western educated intellectuals which foregrounds the reform period in pre-independent India. Modern education developed by the British rulers was hugely appropriated by the Hindu community. As for the Muslims, their position after the mutiny of 1857 further weakened their position, reducing them to a marginalized community. They themselves kept aloof from colonial modern education on the basis of their religious ideas, and the loss of Muslim rule posed a serious problem to their identity. This further worsened the condition of the community, sharpening the sense of superiority of the Western Christian civilization. In this context, several religious scholars had emerged to defend the community from these external influences by resorting to a rational interpretation of Islamic text. The towering figure of Shah Waliullah Dehlavi, 1703 to 1762, was one of them. He was a prominent scholar and expert in the prophetic teachings or hadith, and was an influential reformer. His magnum opus, Hujat Allah al-Baliga, is a very renowned book in the Islamic world even now. It deals with spiritual and metaphysical themes related to the human mind and was very important for the development of Sufism. He was contemporary of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab of Arabia, the founder of the Wahhabi movement. Dehlavi was considered one of the prominent Islamic reformers, and he has interpreted Islam in a simple and systematic way. K. Nizami says that all the socio-religious movements, activities of Indian Muslims that followed at a later period centered around the thought of Sayyid Waliullah, who contributed essential elements to the growth of progressive thoughts in Islam. The main contribution of Shah Waliullah and his insistence on speculative thinking among Muslims in India, with this renewed emphasis on ijtihad. His use of reason and arguments have, or perhaps a more fundamentalist significance, but they inspired the formula of Neo-Mutazili modernism of Sayyid Ahmad Khan, who had received his early education in the seminary of Waliullah's successors in Delhi, of Shabili scholasticism, and of religious reconstruction of the thought of Iqbal. Aziz Ahmad argues that the more classical influences of Waliullah's concept of ijtihad are reflected in the workshop of the ulama of Deoband, whose religious ideology was directly shaped by his school. The Wahhabi movement is one of the earliest and most important, influential and still relevant movement which focused on puritanical, pedantic version of Islam, which emerged in the first half of the 18th century in Arabia and later made its pervasive presence throughout the Islamic world, including the Indian subcontinent. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, the founder of the Wahhabi movement, further developed the puritanical ideas of the medieval Islamic theologian Imam ibn Taymiyyah, and he fully focused on his own version of Islamic monotheism in the more radical way. H.A.R. Jib and J.H. Kramers conclude the very important doctrines of Wahhabism with their emphasis on a rigid puritanical monotheistic adherence of the faith had a deep impact on the traditional Islamic world. Basam Tibi argues that Wahhabi movement was not only a religious revivalist movement, it had political content also. Its potentially nationalistic aspirations were directed against the Ottoman foreign rule. The Indian branch of the Wahhabi movement of Ahmad Shah Barelvi has also actively participated in the Indian freedom struggle, and that offered a serious threat to the British supremacy in the 19th century. Ahmad Shah Barelvi was greatly influenced by the teachings of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab and Shah Waliullah Dehlavi. Both the leaders condemned all the changes and innovations of Islam, and they believed that the return to the pristine form of Islam is the only way to survive the socio-political atrocities facing the Muslim community. Ahmad Shah Barelvi's movement had two different objectives, like those of almost all religious rebellion. Those were to purify the Islamic religious ideals and preserve it in their pristine form, and it was marked by a fight against the alien rulers of India, thereby aiming at reinstatement of the Islamic State. Shah Wajiullah's and Shah Abdul Aziz's political thought developed into its practical culmination through Ahmad Shah Barelvi and his Wahhabi movement. The political career of Ahmad Shah Barelvi was revolutionary, and he waged war against the British, but he was killed in the Battle of Balakot on 6th May 1831, a battle against the Sikhs. After his death, Vilayat Ali and Inayat Ali, the two brothers of the Sadiqepur family of Patna, were influenced by his ideas, and in 1847 they started full preparation for an absolute war against the British rule in India from base camp at Sithana. The British took up brutal measures, and the period between 1860 to 65 witnessed a series of trials by which all the principal leaders of the Wahhabi movement were arrested. Through the Ambala trial of 1864 and the Patna trial of 1865, the leaders were deported to the Andamans. Later, after the failure of the Indian Mutiny of 1857, Muslims were roused from their pessimism and inactivity by Sayyid Ahmad Khan and his followers, and he persuaded the community to accept the Western education and to cooperate with the British, and his efforts finally led to the establishment of a college. the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, which eventually turned out to be university, Aligarh Muslim University, that combined a new type of education with the adherence to Islamic doctrine. Several other reformers like Justice Amir Ali, Nawab Mohsinul Mulk, Maulvi Qadu Baksha and others followed him. Even though the Aligarh movement was primarily a North Indian phenomenon, its intellectual influence extended much beyond the borders of India. The founders of this movement belonged to a class of professional or salaried gentry known as the Shurafa, which had furnished administrators to pre-colonial states and now attempted to do the same for the colonial India. Syed Ahmad Khan was himself a minor aristocrat, and the Aligarh group or movement called itself a party or school in English and a movement or tahreek in Urdu, and whose important activities the college apart comprised the Mohammedan Educational Conference and the alumni writings, including a journal. As the aftermath of the same incident, unlike Syed Ahmad Khan, the two English-educated Muhammad Qasim Nanotvi and Rashid Ahmad Gangohi established a madrasa in small North Indian town called Deoband in the United Province, now Uttar Pradesh, in 1867 to disseminate its Islamic culture and law and the tradition attributed to the Prophet and to preserve it from the onslaught of British colonialism. And in that regard, they decided to garner money only from inside the community. Thousands of other madrasas, all called Deobandi, even without any formal affiliation with the parent madrasa, share the same doctrinal orientation. Within several South Asian Islam, the Deobandis distinguish themselves not only from the Shias but also from Sunni rivals such as the Barelvis and the Ahli Hadith, both of which also emerged in India in the second half of the 19th century. Barelvis emphasized the authority not just of the Prophet but of the saints and holy people too, to whom they were looking for guidance and for considering them as vehicles of mediation between God and the human beings. At the same time, the Ahl-i-Hadith, broadly known as the Salafis or the Wahhabis, who were giving more importance to prophetic teachings, Hadith, than the saints and holy people, even than traditional four schools and laws, and they stringently insisted on the Quran and Hadith as exclusive and directly accessible sources of guidance. Several Sufi orders also emerged in India, not only as a moral but also as comprehensively socio-religious force. They emphasized on personal piety and retained attitudes of accommodation and adaptation, and declined religious or communal conflicts and showed a way for the humanity. One of the earliest Sufis is Khwaja Moinuddin Sijzi, but the historical information of the early period of his life is not survived to this day. He arrived in India through Lahore in the year 1185, and later he settled in Ajmer, which was part of Qutbuddin Aibak's empire. After his demise in 1236, the image of Sufi saint became famous. Another very important Sufi is Sheikh Nizamuddin Awliya, who exerted ennobling influence, whether it is in religion, politics, education, literature, music, and above all, the style of the human relations. He also developed the Chist concept and nonviolence into a doctrine of socio-religious tolerance and pacifism. He refused to extend moral support to the policy of expansion of the Delhi Sultans and turned out to be the real cause of his conflict with the authorities. Beyond the mere return of original Islam and envisaging some reforming measures, some groups brought in another idea to the full expression of Islam. It needs statehood, the idea articulated by Maududi's Jamaat-e-Islami. Some other very important attempts were made in defense of Islamic doctrine in terms of modern Western thought were, first, the reconstruction of religious thought in Islam by Iqbal, and the second, the Tarjuman al-Qawm, which is primarily as a community on the Quran, but his interpretation and understanding of the religions was dazzling, unlike those of the Wahhabis. Reform in post-independent India. After the independence, India opted to be a secular country, but the constitution makers reached to the compromise of the application of the personal laws of all communities under the directive principles of constitution. Earlier, the topmost leaders of the Indian National Congress, such as Gandhi and Nehru, had given assurance to the leaders of Jamaat-ul-Ulama in Hind that no Islamic law will be abolished after the independence. But in this period, neither the endeavors to reform the community nor the reform of the personal laws take place. However, after the partition, the middle-class intelligentsia of the Muslim community had almost fully migrated to Pakistan, leaving behind poor, illiterate Muslims completely under the influence of conservative theologians who were deeply resistant to the idea of modernity modernity and educationally and economically further backward. Muslim populace naturally could not beget any rival reform leader of movement. We should keep in mind that almost all the pre-independent reformers came from good family backgrounds. Unlike the pre-independence period ulama, who enthusiastically participated in the freedom struggle and became that of what they engaged in social reform, ulama did not have any mass base, but they were quite unsure of their prestige. Furthermore, the non-involvement of some ulama in real politics and the beefing up of the caste, religious, regional and identity politics further deteriorated an already worsened position of the ulama in the community. Besides, unlike Raja Ram Mohan Roy's effort to undermine some of the evils of Brahmanism, Muslim leaders blindly buttressed the uniform civil code, and they were quick to hype that the Muslims are basically rigid and fanatics and would never change. As a consequence, when the conservatives adopted a more rigid stand and launched the counter-campaign that was a conspiracy going to destroy Islamic belief, it made almost impossible any attempt to reform in the personal laws, even though the same reformation was implemented by Abu Ayyub Khan in 1962 through a presidential ordinance with the consensus of religious scholars and modernists. The theory of conspiracy and the incessant anti-Muslim riots in India impede any kind of inside reform, which further reflected in the unfortunate aggressive response of the Muslim community with regard to Shah Bano case in 1986. Apart from this, several Western-educated Muslim intellectuals, while some of them focused on the political and the social reform, others focused on application of the contemporary literary and philosophical criticism to the study of the Quran and Islamic history. It is also important to note that among the Muslim women, some significant endeavors to devise a nikahnama which stipulate conditions against triple divorce and polygamy in the Marriage Act contract is on. For the goal of achieving gender equality under Muslim personal law, some Islamic feminist groups are also taking the initiative to reform in accordance not with the Indian Constitution or the universal human rights principles, rather with the Quranic teachings, which they claim grant Muslim women numerous rights that in practice are routinely denied them by the patriarchal interpretations of the conservative ulama. Conclusion, Module 23. In this module, we have looked at reform movements in Islam in India. Reform is a word that is used, as we have seen in the last module, in the context of the changes that have happened in religious communities in India when they came in contact with the European colonial kind of intervention. With regard to Islam, we have seen in this module that there are two qualitatively different types of reform, one internal and the one external. Thank you.